After that night hiding in the ship's hold, when the violin became their cry for rescue, they left Hiva Oa with the salt of the sea still clinging to their clothes. Slick stayed behind, sailing toward Honolulu, while the narrator returned to Apolu, greeted Nina and Pompo, and set out once more. From that farewell, the journey took on a new rhythm. The green islands faded on the horizon, giving way to bustling harbors where the sound of engines mingled with the hum of his bow, the heartbeat of youth. There, in the great city, awaited nights spent on wooden benches, dawns watched from the edge of the pier, and a carved figurehead whose face could stir a lifetime of dreams. So join us now, as we enter the next chapter, following the wanderer with his violin, listening as music leads him through ports, forests, and the fleeting, shining encounters that make a life worth remembering. You're watching this video on Good Stories. Welcome, my friends. I hope you enjoy every moment of it. Thank you so much for subscribing and hitting that like button. Your support truly means the world to me. There was a steamer in Apia Harbor, and I was lucky enough to get a berth aboard her. I think I had only been in Apia 2 days when she got steam up to leave for Fiji and New South Wales. I berthed forward in the forecastle. She was a tramp steamer and carried sail to help the decrepit engines and take the vessel to port when they broke down. Just before we left, we took on a cargo of natives bound for somewhere. They were a mixed lot, most of them Samoans or Malay Polynesians, and among them some Solomon Islanders who had arrived in Apia a week before, waiting to be transhipped. They were berthed forward between decks. Most of them were dressed in dead men's clothes, collected in the South Sea Island morgues, after the first occupants had no further use for them: dead sailors, beachcombers, coolies, suicides. Indeed, all the derelict corpses of life's drama who lay in their final resting place in the unvisited cemeteries of the Pacific Islands. These natives were a cheerful, indifferent lot of people at least, when they got over the first pang of parting from their relatives. But that grief was soon over, for they each believed that they were leaving their native isle to return someday with fortunes from the promised El Dorado. Hope is as intense in natives of the South Seas as it is in white people. Next day they started to sing cheerfully, and came up on deck in shoals to catch from the galley, and get the cook to bake their breadfruit 11 and yams. Some had their wives with them, big fat women with glittering eyes. They were supposed to keep down below after dark, but they came up on deck and went pattering by us as we stood by the forepeak hatchway smoking with the sailors. About 3 days after we left Apia, bound for Suva, a hurricane came on, and the boat rolled and pitched till we thought she would turn a somersault or turn turtle. The natives between decks were shut down. We heard their yells as the massive clinging arms and bodies were hurled about as the boat rolled and shipped seas over the bows. The name breadfruit is more poetical than the flavor of the fruit, which tasted to the writer like sweet turnips. At midday next morning the wine suddenly ceased and the sun burst out. Only those who had experienced the howling chaos of mountainous seas, blackness, and wind would have believed what the weather had really been a few hours before. The bosun and the carpenter were interesting characters, both typical shellbacks of the island trading type. The bosun looked like a priest, his face was weather-beaten and his nose twisted. He had no hair on his face, head or neck, and wore a cap to hide his polished skull. His chum the carpenter fairly wallowed in hair, had bristly eyebrows, a bristly beard, head and neck, and a vast mustache. You could only see his fierce, twinkling eyes as he sat arguing in the forecastle with the bosun. Those two never agreed on any subject, but were inseparable companions. The bosun, I believe, loved to be contradicted by his shipmate, and if no sudden response was made to any assertion he might make, he at once looked round fiercely and said that silence was equivalent to disbelief, and they might as well call him a liar and be done with it. I recall how he sat by his bunk on his sea chest and said, "Remember him?" "I should think I does. Very old man." He had been a skipper on the trader between the Samoan and Makesa's group, a nice old fellow. He was blind, quite blind in both eyes. At this the argument commenced immediately, as the carpenter looked up and said, of course he was blind in both eyes. He wouldn't be blind if he could still see with one eye, would he? Then, as he hammered at the hinge of the sea chest he was mending, the bosun shouted, "Stow your gab, you clever son of a nigger, you're. Isn't a man blind if he's blind in his eye?" Course he ain't. He's only lost one eye. Your swab. Two with yer. If he's lost his eye, ain't he blind in it? At this, the carpenter's unshaved face fairly steamed with heat as he appealed to the sailor standing by. A man ain't blind if he's lost his one eye, is he? Well, slowly answered the sailor solemnly, if he couldn't see out of the eye that was blind, I should say that he was blind in it. At this, the boatswain spat on the deck, the carpenter thrust his bearded chin forward, and they started to bet heavily on the matter, and the Norwegian cook, who had come in to see what the shouting was about, wiped his mouth with his dirty sack apron, and said, Mein dear friends, which eye was the man's blind in? You're son of a German sea cook. I said the man was stone blind in both eyes, so, he hadn't any eyes at all, roared the infuriated boatswain. Well, now, said the sea cook, as he stroked his short Van Dyke beard and looked astonished, he vash not blind then, he hof no eyes to be blind in at all. For how cans a man be blind in ze eyes if he hof no eyes? The boatswain turned purple, spluttered out your gaudy cheeky, then suddenly lost his temper, made a run, and pushed the cook, who nearly fell to the deck. I will show you what a blind eye is, shouted the enraged Norwegian sea cook. Bear witness, shouted the boatswain, looking at the sailors and members of the black squad, who were all standing around to see fair play. The cook has insulted me by saying that a blind man has no eyes. Then the Norwegian made a rush at the old boatswain. It gave the whole crew a lot of trouble to separate them. Then the boatswain cooled down and said it was his own fault for not simply saying the man was blind and saying nothing whatever about his eyes if he hadn't got any. Then they all had a drop of rum together and were good friends till the next argument cropped up, and they took sides once more. At other times they would sit yarning, and as I listened, sitting on my sea chest, I heard many terrible and indescribable things, true enough too, I have not the slightest doubt, but only fit to be told here after considerable prunings from the facts. There was an old Solomon Island native just by us, down in the forepeak. He was a kind of overseer, and had to look after the natives in the hold, and separate the various tribal characters if they fought, which they often did. Now this overseer was a garrulous chap, and though he was hideous enough, it was interesting to hear what he said. He was over 50 years of age, and we gathered from what he let out that he had eaten long pig in his youth. One calm, hot night, when the engines were clanking steadily away, while the skipper walked the poop and the steward slept, we were all sitting in the forecastle. Some of the sailors were in their bunks, and a few others smoking and playing cards beneath the dim oil lamp. The garrulous native overseer was talking away for all he was worth, when suddenly the boatswain leaned over his bunk and said, "Shut up, you're son of a cannibal. Me no heathen, I good Christian man. Once long ago I eat long pig, but since then I have saved white sailor from being eaten, and been friend to white girl." "Eh," said the boatswain, as he pricked his ears up. The carpenter said, "Gor blimey, you've eaten." Quickly a sailor nudged him, so that we might hear all about it. And one of the crew, who had been playing cards, shuffled the pack and said quietly, "Tell us all about it." The grim-looking, half-naked savage nodded his head and started off. Many years ago now, a terrible hurricane was blowing off the Solomon Isle of Burka, when the islanders suddenly sighted a full-rigged sailing ship in distress. Sunset blazed behind her, and they could see the torn sails and the decks taking the seas over, as she helplessly drifted before the gale that was bringing her shoreward. That night, when the stars were flashing through rifts in the clouds, which had broken up and left pools of blue in the sky, they saw the great ship within a mile of the shore, with walls of living waters breaking over her. One or two sailors were just discernible, clinging to the spars aloft. And then suddenly a mountain of water rose and the masts disappeared. In the early morning, the natives gathered the bodies of the dead sailors together, put them in old salt beef ship's barrels, and hid them on the sands just under the water near the shore. For the bloodthirsty tribe who found them were cannibals. For of the crew were still alive the boatswain, the chief mate, the cook, and the ship's doctor. And a girl, who was the skipper's daughter. The boatswain dropped his pipe on the floor. The sailors all looked round and left their cards, and one or two went few. Then listened, and the half-savage native continued to this effect. They took the 4 living men up the shore and put them in a cave, and hid them so that a rival tribe they had lately been fighting with should not get hold of them before they could eat them. The chief of the tribe claimed the pretty white girl. She was not more than 17 years old. They took her up to the stronghold, made a big festival fire, and had a feast from one of the dead sailors who had been washed ashore. While the whole tribe sat squatting in a circle, watching and waiting while the flames of the fire flickered and hissed, the white girl, tied to a cocoa palm by the hands, looked round at them all with staring, frightened eyes. Then the hideous cannibal chief caught hold of her and told her that, if she would be his wife, he would save the 4 white men who were alive in the cave. For a while they could not stop her screaming, and then she looked up at the chief and said, "Bring me the white men first." And he shook his head and said, "No, later, when they were eating." You're watching this video on Good Stories. If you're enjoying it and find it inspiring, don't forget to hit that like button. It's the best way to support the channel and keep these stories coming. And dancing wildly round the terrible fire, another chief of a tribe inland came suddenly out of the forest close by and joined in the feast. When he saw the white girl staring, tied to a palm just behind them, he looked at her longingly and offered to buy her from the first chief. I was a young man then, about 20 years old, and I had been a servant off and on to the white missionaries who lived 20 miles away round the coast. I made up my mind to steal away at daybreak and tell them about the white girl and the 4 sailors in the cave. For that old chief who had come and tried to buy the white girl was a bloodthirsty cannibal, and he only wanted to buy the girl so that he could eat her. It was well known by all the tribe that he loved the flesh of women and would risk his life to eat a white girl's breasts. In the shadows by the trees she still sat, with her wildly staring eyes, appealing to the glittering eyes of the chief and to dumb heaven. Most of the tribe squatted or lay at full length round the dying fire, their hideous appetites satisfied and their bellies distended. I saw the 2 powerful chiefs stand arguing. And then the chief who longed for the white girl turned away from the other and looked with fierce, hungry eyes at the shivering girl a moment, ere his dark, naked limbs strode away into the forest. My heart leapt with joy as I saw his big form go. I felt that I could now easily save the white girl. For I knew that white men were brave and would come directly. I arrived before them and told them all that had happened. Walking as near as I dared to the white girl, I spoke to her in English. I said for words only, "I see white men." I could not see her glance, as I dared not look her way. For the chief sat close by, rubbing his chin and grunting sleepily. I sat myself down by a tree and slept, thinking to go off and get help before the day broke. Suddenly, I was awakened by a great noise of shouting and running. I jumped to my feet. The tribal chief was lifting his war club and dashing it to the ground to ease his terrible rage. And then crash, he smashed the sentinel's skull. It cracked like an eggshell. The man had slept instead of watching. The white girl had gone. At first I was delighted, for I thought she had escaped. But instead of that she had been carried off by the great girl-eating chief. Directly he said that all the forecastle swallowed their tobacco smoke and said, "Well, I'm." The boatswain muttered, "Holy heaven," and then one of the sailors said, "How did you know the stinking swine of a chief had her?" We all somehow listened hopefully, for the overseer looked so earnest, and we did not want to think we were hearing the truth. A yarn was all right, but this made the hands restive and the eyes blaze. However, he continued, some of the tribe, who were camping by a lagoon not far inland, were suddenly awakened by an agonized scream. Looking through the jungle, they saw several canoes being rapidly paddled across the moonlit waters, and in the foremost canoe they recognized the feared, bloodthirsty cannibal chief, Torau. He was a giant of a fellow, nearly 7 feet in height and of tremendous girth, and so there was no mistaking him. He was paddling with one arm and held the white girl under the other as you would hold a strangled rabbit. "Lummy," said one sailor, as 1 or 2 others wiped their perspiring faces with their red handkerchiefs, listening as they held on to the stanchion in the middle of the forecastle. While the tramp steamer rolled and pitched along across the Pacific, heaving at intervals to the heavy crosswell. Vel now," muttered the Norwegian cook, as he sat on the side of his bunk taking his trousers off. The Solomon Islander continued, "I was young then and could run with the swiftness of a horse, and, knowing that there was no time to lose, I never stopped once as I ran across country and round the coast for miles. At length, about midday, I arrived at Tuka village, which is on the coast, rushed up the shore and thumped at the door of the first white man's bungalow that I saw. They all came rushing from their houses when they heard what I had to say. Directly they heard all, they rushed back to their homes and got their guns and revolvers, and in no time were all astride on horseback galloping across the country. At sunset we arrived at the village where the caves were. I was brave, for I knew the white men would protect me, so I led the way at once to the caves. But we were too late. They were deserted. The sailors had been taken away. At once the leader of the white men, who was a big man with a heavy gray mustache, shouted to me that I should take them to the spot where they had eaten the sailor. Quickly I ran on in front, and they all came behind, their faces stern and white-looking. When we reached the place they said nothing, but all quietly tightened the reins of the horses, and then, dismounting, crept together to the edge of the forest. The white man who led them made a terrible oath when they all peeped through the bamboos. For the savages had just clubbed 2 of the sailors, and a great fire was blazing in the middle of the cleared patch by the huts, and not far off from the dead bodies stood the chief mate, bound hand and foot, waiting to be clubbed too. The white men hesitated one moment, then rushed across the cleared patch, firing their revolvers. Several of the natives fell dead as the tribe scampered off into the forest. They only saved the chief mate out of the 4 men who had survived that shipwreck. They burnt the village to the ground and buried the bodies of the bosun and the cook. Not far from where the fire had been they found some shriveled clothes and a small peaked cap. In the pockets were some little medicine phials and, close by, the ship's doctor's feet still in his boots. I told them about the ship's salt beef barrels hidden under the shore sand. They dug them all up and took the bodies miles away and buried them. The skipper's daughter was never heard of anymore. About 2 years after that, High Chief Torau, who stole the white girl, became a Christian and taught the native children Lotu songs in the mission rooms. I went and lived with the white men at Tuka. They gave me good clothes, and I was their servant and found them good and kind masters. "Clear out of this, Folksley, your god-ass son of a cannibal!" shouted the bosun directly the overseer had finished. And though he had befriended our countrymen, we'd have felt a bit disgusted, and knew how the bosun felt as we looked up at the thick-lipped Solomon Islander's face. The foregoing is as much as I can tell you of the main facts of the native story. I have left out all the gruesome embellishments and the heart-rending cruelty of the natives' description of the white girl's grief in the hands of the cannibal monsters. Let us hope it was not true, but I must admit many things made my heart thump as I listened to all that seemed to true. The bosun and his shipmate never argued over that tale. The Norwegian cook at last pulled his trousers right off and said, "Vel now, it's too terrible to think of," and swung his legs round into his bunk. I turned in also, just opposite him, and said, "Let's keep the lamp on, I don't feel sleepy tonight." Next day we dropped anchor in Suva harbor and stayed there 2 days. I had previously been to the Fiji group and stayed there for a considerable time, having various experiences with the natives and traders, experiences which will appear in the second half of these reminiscences. The crew went ashore and had a fly round, walked the parade, and visited all the drinking establishments. The bosun and his mate came back arm in arm, arguing at the top of their voices. They had been drinking rather heavily. When they got on board, the bosun sighted the natives poking their heads out of the forepeak hatchway, and, thinking of the tale the overseer had told us, he shouted at them, "Get down below, you're cannibals," and then made a rush for them. We were obliged to hold on to him to keep him from going down between decks. At last we got him into his bunk, but none of us had any sleep, for he shouted about cannibals all night and swore that we had got thousands of them on board. Next day, just before we left Suva, a passenger came on board. He was an old gentleman with bristly eyebrows, who wore a monocle. He carried 2 large portmanteaus and came puffing up the gangway, and directly he got on deck, he started shouting, "Steward! Steward!" Spying the bosun by the main hatch, he mistook him for the steward, and, looking through his eyeglass, said, "Where's the saloon?" At the same time he handed him the largest of the portmanteaus. With disgust wrinkling his florid nutcracker face, the bosun pointed forward. Off went the old man, muttering something under his breath about the discourteous behavior of sailors. "Down there!" shouted the bosun, as the passenger got up against the forepeak and called once more, "Steward!" Then down the forepeak he went. In a few seconds we heard a wild yell, and up came the old fellow, hatless, with his face pallid with fright. He had landed in the middle of the huddled natives below. "Help! Help!" he shouted. I told him it was all right, put his hat on for him, and went down quickly and fetched up his portmanteau, which he had dropped in his fright. He was all of a tremble. His hand shook visibly as he clutched his property. The German steward came hurrying forward and, when he sighted the old gentleman's massive gold chain and jeweled fingers, almost fell forward on his face, bowing and scraping in his apologies. When the old fellow recovered, he swore he'd sue the bosun in Sydney for damages. We had a fairly fine passage across to New South Wales, and in a week sighted Sydney Heads. We dropped anchor out in the stream, and the old passenger went off in a tender. He had got over his adventure and shook his umbrella good-naturedly at the bosun, who grinned at him over the forecastle head. I was pleased to see the lovely shores of Sydney Harbour again. That same night, I stood on deck and saw the beautiful seaboard city rising grandly, with her spires and walls, as moonlight crept over the horizon. Sydney by night is a sight that makes you easily understand the cornstalk's pride in their beloved city. Next day we berthed by Circular Quay. It was fearfully hot, real dog day weather. Hospitality abounds in Sydney, and one never need feel lonely, for on stepping on to the wharf, I was once more enthusiastically welcomed by an immense crowd of mosquitoes. We can joke after, but I did not see life then as I do now. How I recall it all, my beautiful youth, as a woman's heart secretly remembers her first love, and gazing back feels the old passion, sees the rosy horizon of dreams. The absolute certitude of old vows, spoken by that voice that expressed all the happy universe. Yes, so do I remember the sleepless, hungry nights under the stars that shone over the trees, nights radiant with dreams. Dear audience, this memoir is a voyage through the seas of youth, storms raging, engines coughing, the hold packed with migrants, sailors both rough and humorous, and a chilling tale of shipwrecked souls. You're watching this video on Good Stories. Welcome, my friends. I hope you enjoy every moment of it. Thank you so much for subscribing and hitting that like button. Your support truly means the world to me. Yet after all the chaos come the dawn over Suva, the moonlit harbor of Sydney, and the aching memory of a youth brilliant with dreams yet hungry with struggle. Life will bring tempests that knock us down, and dark holds that make us afraid. But keep the three things the storyteller carried: ears that listen, feet that keep moving after the storm, and eyes that still see beauty in the night. Then you too will reach the shore, not because the sea is calm, but because your heart endures. And finally this, keep your compassion sharp. When the music swells, whether it is a village chant or a cornet in the dark, listen for the single human note that does not boast and does not beg. Follow that note, it will lead you home. I had lived in Sydney 5 or 6 years before, when I had run away from a ship in Brisbane and had come across to Sydney full of dreams and hope. I was then only 14 years of age. How vividly I recall those days and nights. Once more I stand on old Circular Quay, and seem again to breathe through my dreams the turbulent poetry of emigrant sin and sorrow. For how many cargoes of human lives have been brought across the world and then dumped down on the quay. I dream on, and see the silent wool clipper ships lying alongside the wharfs, the tall masts and long yards at rest beneath the sky. The fine carved figureheads look alive, their grand, allegorical faces gazing, their outstretched arms pointing toward Sydney's silent streets. They seem to express dimly to me some substance of great poetic thought, as though I stood on the mysterious shores of the heaven whence those spiritual minds that conceived them drew their inspiration, when with creating brain and moving fingers they carved such sad, wonderful faces. Faces destined to be exiled for years on voyages across wild oceans. I am a boy again, and I am thrilled with such a feeling as a poet has when he treads visionary worlds and forgets his sad reality. How happy I feel as I move along in the white moonlight from wharf to wharf, gazing on each wooden ship and wondering on their past voyages, what seas they crossed ere I was born, and what the seaports looked like when they came sailing down, with weather-beaten sailors staring from the forecastle head. How distinctly I remember it all! I cannot move from one ship's side. The figurehead is that of some beautiful goddess with a crown of bronzed hair, wherein a dove flutters. Her face represents, exactly, my romantic ideal of all the tender beauty of woman as I dreamed of it in my early boyhood. It is a beautiful face. I gaze from the wharf at it with fascinated eyes, All is silent except for the plomp of the waters against the ship's side as the tide ebbs. Still I gaze at her praying hands, as with wide-open eyelids she stares across the moonlit quay at the sleeping city. I went back to my room and dreamed of that perfect face. So strangely was I impressed by its beauty that I felt a longing to find some living type resembling it. The next day, I walked up the Sydney streets and earnestly scanned the faces of the colonial girls. None of them seemed to me as beautiful as the thought of the artist who had fashioned the perfect outlines of my figurehead. The next night, I went down to the quay and gazed once more at her, and then again the following night. But when I arrived on the wharf, to my great sorrow, I found her gone. She had left her beauty in my soul, and though she was only an insensate figurehead, the memory of her features and expression stirred and fired some devotional dream within me, and gave me a poetic reverence for womanhood, a gift from out the great strangeness of things that I have ever cherished. Often in seaports, on my travels from land to land, my comrades wondered why I stood a moment and gazed at the silent sailing ships by the wharf. But, though I searched, I never saw that figurehead again. I suppose they have broken those old wooden ships up now and burnt them on the hearth fires of the cities, and by them other boys have probably dreamed of strange lands. And lovers gazed in the curling flames with shining eyes. Aught little did they dream what their log of firewood had meant to me. And while they kissed with clinging lips the substance of my boyhood dreams, those features that lived spiritually in my imagination fell to ash as the flames faded in the homestead hearth fire. The poetry of Sydney Harbor, with its sights and turmoil of sound, lives in my memory as though today is far off yesterday. I even remember, and feel again, my strange romantic loneliness as I watch the silent ships lying out in the bay. Night, like life, is on the deep, tide-moving waters. In the dark depths the fixed mirrored stars shine steadfastly like eternity, while over them the waters ebb seaward or flow towards the shore. The outline of North Shore, like another continent, rises across the wide harbor, and exactly opposite are the spires of the grand, silent, seaboard city. Some drunken sailor's song floats across the bay from the wine jammer that is lying at anchor out in the stream. Several lights are twinkling across by Miller's Point. The Orient liner, the giant aristocrat of the quay, is agleam with shining portholes. Her funnels belch forth smoke that ascends to the silence. We creep by 3 homeless men and a boy looking for a place to sleep. Our shadows suddenly hurry on with us, as in the moon's gleam we spy the quartermaster on watch at the gangway. No hope there for us, we think, so we go round to the anchored ferry boats and leave the great liner behind. She's off for England tomorrow, dear old England. Oh, magical word to how many exiles in the sleeping city, and especially to us, with our stomachs rumbling with emptiness. The big manly beach ferry boat is moored by the wharf. Our frightened eyes look carefully around, then down on board we go to seek the cushioned settees of the saloon. We slept there last night. Again we creep into the saloon, for of us, Roberts, the ship's stoker, villainous-looking, old, with unshaved face. Ross, the son of the Right Honorable, and the third man, who is a late schoolmaster from a school of great distinction. He is a pessimistic-looking chap, perhaps because he lent Ross his last 10 shillings on the promise of 500% interest when Ross got an expected check from England. Ah, woeful when the night is getting old and cold. How comfortably the warmth of the dim saloon strikes us as we for derelicts creep across. The moonlight is streaming through the portholes. Ross smothers a note of irresistible exultation, for he has spotted a large bunch of bananas on the saloon table. Such sudden, unexpected affluence is too much for me, and even as I wonder why the saloon smells so strongly of fresh tobacco smoke, I sit down plump on the stomach of the ferry boat's night watchman, who is asleep on the settee. A terrible yell of pain escapes the official's lips. Like foreshadows, in one headlong leap we cross the saloon and rush up the gangway. How we scampered across the quay space and then rescued poor old Roberts, the stoker, as he puffed behind and stumbled on the curbside and fell with a crash. Under the trees in the domain, he sat swearing terrifically, but calmed down as we held his blood-splashed face up and examined it by moonlight. The schoolmaster lent his handkerchief of other days to staunch the blood flow. Ross promised another 15 shillings when the check came. Then, under the big leaf tree, with our heads pillowed on our coats or caps, we lay with our faces side by side to sleep. I can still see the many huddled derelicts under the gum trees of Sydney's Hyde Park, disreputable old men and young men, good and bad. I watch by my chums on our big bedroom floor and hear the far cry of the wild animals in the Botanical Gardens Zoo and smell the dewdamp leaves and domain grass. As dawn steals over the windless trees away back beyond the horizon of more years than I like to count, some inexplicable kind of sadness comes over me as I look back to the lost splendor of my derelict days. How wealthy I was with all my youthful unfulfilled promises, and what security I found in the hopeful, manly eyes of men who went down to the sea in ships. How I stuck to them as they yarned together, or sang till the shore cave echoed. The shanty was a paradise, filled with men of mighty deeds, as I gazed with the eyes of boyish inexperience at the stalwart, unshaved men from Frisco and London, and listened to the stories of sad self-sacrifice or great deeds on land and sea, performed in the valiant imagination of those wonderful brains of the world's worst men. I often wonder what I have missed through the inherited taint of vagabondage that is in my blood. Should I have been happier and gained some wealth had I gone ashore in some far country, scorning vagabonds and marching down the track on honest feet, like some Dick Whittington, looking for the lights of some distant city, with my violin slung beside me? I doubt it. If one is really honest, one is sure, someday, to trust the wrong man through not being dishonest oneself. But to go back to my reminiscences at the moment when I arrived in Sydney from Samoa. I did not stay in Sydney very long. I had 3 or 4 pounds in my pocket and did not want to get stranded, so once more I looked around and was lucky enough to secure a berth on a steamer that was going to New Zealand for a cargo of meat, and from there to London. I got a job down in the engine room as a kind of snowman to look after the refrigerators. The chief engineer was a terrible pig. He was a Dutchman and gave me no peace, but made me paint the lower deck iron roof. We eventually had a fight, and I received a black eye, which took a considerable time to cure itself. I made up my mind to leave at the first opportunity. I smelt the freshness of the seawater and tar when we dropped anchor in Oriental Bay. After the first old loafer, who is always waiting in every colonial seaport to say this is God's own country, had said it, I looked about. Oh, the splendor of those days, the glorious homelessness, and the thrilling uncertainty of everything. I stood on the wharf with my violin in my hand, and, though I was almost penniless, I felt like a monarch gazing on his multitude of toiling subjects. Ships of many nationalities lay alongside discharging their cargoes, and the crews mingled with the crowds of embarking or disembarking passengers arriving from or bound for Australia, China, Japan, India, in fact everywhere wealth and poverty massed together. I saw white faces, black faces, yellowish faces, mahogany faces, glittering eyes, blue eyes, black eyes, bilious eyes, dantesque profiles, turbaned heads, thick, black lips, expressing carelessness and humor, and thin, cynical lips. Also self-exiled, broken down, sardonic-looking poets, authors, and musicians from the British Isles. It seemed that the drama of life was being enacted on that wharf, with its hubbub of uncouth voices, Hindu men, and women with rings in their ears, multitudes from the Far East, South, and West. A kind of miniature parade of existence. Airtime's hand swept the whole lot like pawns off the board, it seemed to me, as I watched them embark on the ships to go seaward. I eventually secured a position as violinist in the orchestra of the Opera House in Wellington, and I had comfortable diggings with an English family. I think I should have settled down there, but just as I got to like my landlady and her family, the old father made up his mind to go back to England again. This unsettled me, and I started off on my wanderings again. I got to know a man who hired concert halls. I played at many of his shows, performing Paganini's Carnaval da Venice, also Deburyat's and Spar's concertos. I was received very well indeed, and I should have stopped on at the game, but I was very unfortunate. I could not live on the applause which I received through being billed as the sailor violinist. I wore a cheese cutter cap, at the request of my employer, who indeed tried to go on the same lines as in London, wherefore in prodigies of 20, with baby collars on, appear. I barely got any wages, my employer secured the profits. I never knew a man who could promise so much and give so little as that particular employer of mine did. And what he did give, he gave with such an air of munificence, as though he was conferring a favor on me that I had never expected or earned, that for the moment I was completely disarmed and my protest died on my lips. So one day, I started off with my violin up country. The turmoil of the crowded city streets and my commercial inability had sickened me of trying to do well. When I got on the lonely roads, the old knight-errant fever gripped me. As I stood on the bush track, I saw the primeval forest trees all brightening in the sunlight, while singing winds, bending their tops, blew through them, and wings glittered where, overhead, flocks of cockatoos sped across the sky. At midday, tired out, I came across a small bush town. It was by a river where, on the banks, Maoris camped. I stopped there only for a day and night, and I lodged with two old men who lived in a small, wooden house by a paddock. They were grizzled, retired shellbacks, not from the sea, but from the trackless bushlands. I unfortunately paid them for my lodging in advance, and they at once bought some rum, and sat at their little wooden bench table yarning away till their mumbling voices seemed deep down in their dirty beards. As the rum fumes got more and more to their brains, they ceased telling me their experiences, grew argumentative, and, with fierce eyes, glared at each other till they fell asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. The next day I heard from the farmer, who lived in a shack just across the flat, that they were always drunk, and that the whole bush town thought I was some relative of theirs who had come from abroad to see them. Otherwise they could not think anyone would lodge with them. Once more I tramped off, and after doing about 10 miles, I put up at a homestead in which an Irishman and his wife lived. I was getting short of cash, and was half inclined to sleep out. But though it was very hot by day, a cold wind had blown for several nights. I have quite forgotten the name of that little bush village, but I easily recall the picturesque Maoris who lived by a creek in their pa's stronghold, a beautiful spot, sheltered by cherry trees. I played the violin to them, and two old Maori chiefs, aged and wrinkled, squatted, with delight beaming in their deep eyes, listening to me. They were tattooed with dark blue curves from their lips to their eyebrows, and some of the girls were also decorated with tattoo. The Maori women were very cheerful, and brought me food, fresh water, fish, and vegetables. An extremely beautiful Maori girl, dressed in picturesque Maori style, sat on the grass beside me and sang as I played the violin. The surroundings were wildly romantic, and I must confess that I almost fell in love with her. I kept thinking of her eyes as I lay sleeplessly on the extemporized bed that the Irishman's wife had made up for me in a shed adjoining their homestead. I went across to that pa several times. Indeed, I stopped at the Irishman's all the next day and night. When I went, my Maori girl bade me goodbye, and then, with some little Maori children, she came to see me off and crept by my side along the track till the pa was almost out of sight. Her eyes gazed earnestly into mine as she looked up to me. The wind fluttered her blue frock. In her wealth of hair were stuck crimson and white flowers. I seemed to live once again in the romance of my faded dreams of boyhood. How beautiful she looked as sunset deepened the mystery of her eyes. Gallantly I kissed her, and then, on the top of the hill, waved my hand back to her, and she faded away, and mad Don Quixote, carrying his violin, faded away also. Before it was quite dark, I sat down on the bush grass and played the song she had sung to me on my violin. I half wished I was a Maori and lived in the old days. I am sure I should have gone with a tribe of warriors and attacked that pa and ridden off into the forest with that pretty Maori girl. I slept out that night. I did not fall asleep till midnight, but I made a small fire in my forest bedroom and managed to keep warm. For I opened my violin case out and with some bush grass made a good shelter, though the slight trade wind on the weather side blew cold. In the morning I got up without bother, as I had slept all standing, had a wash in the stream just down by the gullies, and then tramped across the hills to where the smoke arose from a group of homesteads. I counted my money. I hadn't much, I know. But people in the New Zealand bush proved as generous to me as I had found them in the Australian bush a year or so before. As I emerged from under the gum trees, I saw that the village was a decent-sized place of some 50 houses. A main road separated wooden shop buildings, and just behind were the small homes of the population. I had slept late, and the sun was blazing over the forest trees and shining on the tin roofs of the township. As I went across the paddocks, the cows lifted their heads, stared at me, slashed their tails, and moved off. I heard the voices of romping children running about in the scrub of their fenceless gardens. Summing up my courage, I took up a position in the center of the silent main street. Only one or two shops had their shutters down as I stood erect and started to play the violin. I was a good player, and before the first strain of the sentimental operatic selection wailed to a close, the doors of all the shops and houses around me suddenly opened. And out came rushing the children, rosy girls and boys, and women and men, who gazed at me in astonishment. I felt like some Pied Piper of Hamelin, but the mayor did not turn blue to pay a sum to a wandering fellow with a gypsy coat of red and yellow as I fiddled away. The bushmen and the whole population grinned, as though with one mouth of delight, and sunburnt little children rushed up to me with shillings and half-crowns as I moved along, and they scampered behind me. I was well dressed, my gray suit was still new-looking, and my collar passably clean. I appeared outwardly to have a social standing that outrivaled that of my delighted audience. The vagrancy in my blood made me perfectly happy. And when the old storekeeper tapped me on the shoulder and invited me in, I accepted with alacrity, and without a blush the breakfast he gave me. The little children's bonny brown faces looked in at the open door as I ate like a horse. Then they all screamed with delight as I tossed the cat to the wooden ceiling and caught it with one hand. By midday I practically owned the township, for I played in the houses and the children invited me to stop. When I went away and passed up the track, the whole population came to the end of the main street to see me go. They all waved their hands as I faded along the bush path. One never forgets those few hours in life when one has been really happy, and so I have never forgotten that bush township. To the thousands of literary and commercial vagabonds living under the guise of respectability, I give a recipe how to be happy in vagabondage. First, you must have a firm belief in God and be able to keep the belief to yourself. This belief will help you when each great scheme unexpectedly fails. For if you be a true vagabond, your schemes will only benefit others. Ere you go to sleep on the grass, look upon the forest about you as your bedroom. Examine the moon as though it were your lamp. Trim it so that the shadows fall glimmering through the trees on to your face, and keep saying to yourself, I am better off than anyone else. The world is certainly mine. In time you will believe this, and people will see the belief in your eyes and respect you. Be kind to little children you meet on the tramp, and write on your brain the wisdom they speak, for they are the cheerest of vagabonds. Avoid luggage, and throw away your conscience with all your unpaid bills. When you have cast your socks into the bush, place palm or banana leaves in your boots as substitutes. They are cool. I've walked for miles quite happily in banana leaf socks. If you can possibly play a musical instrument, well, take it with you. At the worst, you can pawn it. Never worrying, and when you have no money, keep saying to yourself, there was no money in the world for millions of years before money was invented. Have plenty of tobacco with you. And when you sit under the trees, by your campfire, recall pleasant memories only. Then the birds will serenade you cheerfully. And if you have a good comrade by your side, you will be as to kings. Your sentinels the stars, your domain extending to the skylines around you. Remember that when beggars die, before they put them to bed they wash their feet and place half-crowns on their eyelids so as to keep them closed in deep sleep. If they do that for the dead, what will they do for the living? As the first tramped along, the sun blazed down, and I left the track for the shade of some majestic trees. Across the gullies, I saw a campfire burning and a man cooking food on it. I had run across a New Zealand sundowner. "Hello, matey, how goes it?" he said as I approached. "All right," I answered cheerfully, as he looked at my violin and then up at me and said, "Want some tucker?" I accepted a lump of damper, and, as his old dog greeted me affectionately and licked my hand, I sat down beside him. We tramped along together all that day and slept in a gully off the track. He was an experienced bushman and made up to splendid soft mattresses of leaves and moss, and with the dog's soft muzzle crouched to the ground, its sentinel eyes agleam between us, we slept. And I dreamed of the Maori girl. My companion did not seem extremely gifted, but he was a philosophical and kind companion and never argued, only listened. He had little thought of the morrow. Dead yesterday was the land of his dreams, for he was generally retrospective in his conversation. Nevertheless, he was agreeable, and though I understood little of what he said, the note of the mumble in his beard sounded pleasant. I gathered that he had been tramping for several years and was off to see some friends who lived up country on a farm of their own. We had a sad misfortune together. About an hour after we had left a cattle yard that was just off the track, we were tramping along, and the old fellow was mumbling, when suddenly his dog ran in front of us and started to whimper and yelp, and then fell down. It had evidently eaten something that was poisonous. Before sunset, it died in great agony. My friend, indeed both of us, were very much upset. The poor dog had traveled with him for some years. Before it got dark, we went into the forest under the gum trees, and I dug a hole at the foot of a large blue gum, then covered our silent sentinel over, as possums leapt overhead in the trees. I did everything, for my companion was too upset. I also cut its name, Bill, on the tree trunk. He lent me his knife, and when he spoke his voice sounded husky. "I'm a bit of a fool," he mumbled. "No, you're not, I understand," I said. Next day I gave him a large tobacco plug and some money. But still he walked along by my side, looking in front and never even speaking, as the flocks of parakeets shrieked across the sky. We came to a river with rushing falls and a lagoon beside it caused by the overflow when torrential rain fell in the mountains, which rose miles away, brightening behind us in the sunset. I bathed my feet in the cool water. The bushman looked on, and when I asked him to bathe also he mumbled out that he had bathed like that once before, and was afraid. That same evening, we came across a deserted Maori stronghold. The Juarez huts were in ruins and overgrown. Where the garden had once been, among the tall grass and crowds of everlasting flowers, blossoms like vividly colored crimson and yellow parchment, still grew rock melons, tomatoes and other fruit and vegetables, which the Maoris had cultivated. The silent old bushman, to my astonishment, joined me in my reflections as I stood and gazed on the relic of the once prosperous Pa. "I guess we'll camp here tonight, for it's not too warm these times," he said. And so we went into the one hut that had withstood the rotting encroaching of time and still had a roof on. The floor was carpeted with weeds and flowers. Even the hollow that had served for a fireplace had burst into bloom. And as my quiet old comrade, bending by the door, gathered dead scrub and gumwood to make a fire to boil the billiken water, the wind moaned fitfully through the forest boughs overhead, I fancied I heard the dead Maori's voices calling and echoing in the forest depths, and the laughter of girls who were long ago dead. I was told by my comrade that it was the ruins of a Pa stronghold that had been attacked by an enemy tribe, all of the defenders having been killed. As the shadows closed and sunset left a gleam out westward, we sat together. In the corner of the wharry, the sundowner had made our beds, so placed by the bushman's instinct that they were completely sheltered from the drafty weather side. My comrade, who was so methodical in his habits, and had the night before pulled his boots off and turned in punctually at sunset, seemed wakeful and started talking to me. I understood all he said, for I had got used to his pronunciation, odd though it sounded, owing to his having lost all his teeth. I had been playing the violin to him, and as he sat intently listening, with his bearded chin on his hands, I played on, very pleased to find that he appreciated music. First, I had played a commonplace jig, thinking that it would appeal to his uncultivated mind more than direct melody. But when I played a melody from some operatic selection, he at once lifted his half-closed eyelids and said approvingly, "That's right," I inwardly said to myself, "he's an ignorant, low, old fellow. But there's something in him, he's got feeling anyway," and I thought of his manner when I buried his dog. I had been reading a little book, I forget the name of it, but it quoted the philosophers a good deal, and dealt in such subjects as the human mind and the universe as it appeared to the senses. As I looked up at the stars I pondered, and, half in earnest and half with an idea of showing the old bushman how clever I was, I said, "All those stars out there are other worlds." And then I used such phrases as infinite extension, a lot of high-toned phrases that I did not understand myself. He listened silently, and that was sufficient. I felt that, though he had no imagination, he would look upon me with wonder in his eyes and think how clever this youth is, so I rattled on with enthusiasm about the vastness of things and how, but for man's consciousness, there would be no big or little, sight, sound, or time, and how the immensity of space was a mighty ocean of nothingness, a fungoid growth, wherein like jellyfish universes floated in the eternal waters of darkness, and as they twirled and flashed, their sparkles were the stars. Still he listened, and with pride I again delightedly attacked his profound inferiority, striving to explain that all material and immaterial things were chimeras of the mind's madness. that crept on shadowy feet through a vast nothing, which was the universe. I told him that he was not then listening to me by the campfire, but was as the image of myself, an image that I saw at that moment in his wide-open eyes, as he suddenly looked up at me and said, "That'll do. If there's nothing, then your opinions, and those of all the philosophers, are nothing." My hearing seemed to have gone wrong. He mumbled off a Latin phrase. I knew it was Latin, but that's about all I did know. His gray, deep-set eyes looked steadfastly at me. The lightning rapidity of intuition telegraphed to my brain a startling message, which in human speech would go this way: tick, tick, your old bushman, whom you think you are teaching, knows more than you think he does. To feelings struggled within me. One mockingly laughed at my discomfiture at being such a fool, and the other smiled with pleasure to find my old man was not one. I quickly recovered, and in my heart thanked the fungoid universe that it was dark, so that the old man could not see my blush as I dropped my pipe and groped for it in the shadows. And then I received another shock, for he quietly picked my violin up and very quietly started to play. His fingers were stiff, and the bow once slid over the bridge, but it was very evident that somewhere, back in the past, my mumbling old bushman had been a decent violin player. Removing the fiddle from the depths of his dirty beard, he said quietly, "That's a French-made fiddle. Not a bad tone either. You can tell that by the curve of the back and the shape. Ça va." Then he held it up in the moonlight and, moving his wrinkled finger along the fine curves of my violin, laid it down beside me. "You've been a good violin player in your time," I replied. "Yes," he said, and not a word more did I get out of him, except, as he knocked the ash from his corn-cob pipe, "It's getting late, chappie." Then with a sigh he lay down in the corner on his bed and almost immediately went off to sleep. He snored vigorously as I lay beside him, quite sleepless. I looked at the outline of his sleeping face, which I could just distinguish by the stream of moonlight that came through the broken wall opposite us. Whether it was because of my just acquired knowledge that he was not an uneducated derelict, I don't know, but I fancied the outline of his face looked decidedly refined, notwithstanding the gray, unkempt beard and sweaty grime. Next morning we rose early, and the bushman cooked the breakfast on a fire which he built by the deserted Ware's doorless passage. And as he poured hot tea into a mug from his big billy can and handed it to me, he placed in it the last remaining bit of sugar, going without sugar himself. I noticed this, but when I remonstrated he simply said, "Never you mind, chappie. You're not as hardened as I am." I tried to learn something of his history, but to all my interrogations he was either silent or evasive. One thing I did learn, and that was that he was by birth an Englishman. That same day, after crossing some very rough but wildly beautiful country, we arrived at a homestead where there were several outhouses being built. It turned out to be my comrade's destination. The owners gave him a great welcome, took us both inside, and in no time had a table laid ready and a good feed of meat and pumpkin for us. They also were emigrant English folk. As we sat at that grand table-tat, a venerable old blind man, who had been a sailor, sat at the shanty door, secured from the blazing sun by the shade of the thickly clustered grapevines, and sang, "Oh, ho, Rio, we're bound for Rio Grande." He had retired, in England, from the sea many years before, and was the father of our host, who had sent home for him and paid his passage out to New Zealand. He was a jolly old fellow and, though over 80 years of age, danced a hornpipe and sang, in spite of being quite blind. How his white whiskers and red beak nose-tossed as I played the fiddle, and he shuffled his feet and sang, and the boys from the next homestead, a mile over the slopes, watched with delighted eyes. "Avast there! Turn to," he would say, as he asked for a bit more of anything at the table to eat. And he loved to say that his rheumatism had given him a twinge on his weather side, or on his starboard side or his stern, as he moved his sightless eyes about and swayed, as though he walked a rolling deck, across the shanty floor. The last I saw of my traveling comrade the bushman was when he was sawing poles in two and carefully measuring them with his little rule. Several new outhouses were being built, and his friends gave him a job for a few days. When the job was finished, I have no doubt he went off once more on the track, with his home on his back. I never heard why he lived that life, or who he had been away back in the has-been past, but I took good care after my experience with him not to try and talk philosophy or teach shabby-looking old men. Very soon after I bade the New Zealand bushfaller goodbye, I went off visiting various townships with my violin and became a wandering troubadour. I grew so well off that I was able to go on, devoid of all worries, and see a great deal of New Zealand's romantic scenery. Dear audience, this chapter is a hymn to vagabond youth and the strange teachers we meet on the road. A runaway boy haunts Sydney's wharves, falls in love with a ship's figurehead, sleeps on ferry benches, then drifts to New Zealand. He earns meals with a violin, is crowned for a day by a small bush town, nearly falls for a Maori singer, and learns humility from a ragged bushman who plays better than he boasts and quotes quietly instead of preaching. Beauty can ignite a life, hunger can sharpen wonder, and wisdom often wears dusty boots. Carry a craft that opens doors, treat strangers with courtesy. Hold fast to curiosity and courage. If you must wander, wander kindly. The world repays a listening heart and steady feet.